Go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Mastering Retention podcast. I'm Tom Hammond, co-founder of UserWise and your host today. Today, I am delighted to talk to Abhay Ramakrishnan, who is currently at DECA. And I don't know if you guys know anything about DECA games, but like they're folks that they buy these like super old games that everyone else has kind of written off, and then they like turn them into like cash cows and they run them forever and their community loves them and stuff. So like if we're talking about retention and LiveOps, like these guys know what they're doing. So I'm just delighted to have you on the show. But Abhay, before we dive into all the things, I always like to start with how'd you get into games and like what are you doing today? Like what's your story?
Nice. Thanks for having me first. I've listened to almost every episode on the feed. So like, it's great to be on this podcast. I've worn many hats. At one point I used to work as an advertising copywriter. Then I shifted to games. Till very recently, I was a senior game designer, and now I've shifted to the product management vertical. So, I've worked on a lot of different types of games. I've worked with a lot of really smart people, and like I've really learned from all of them. I'm currently at DECA. Before that, I used to work in Zynga, and some of the games which I worked on are Dragon Whale, Zombie Catchers, Farmville 2, and I generally like making games which people like to play with their friends for months, if not years.
I love it. I actually remember back before COVID, when GDC was like normal GDC. I actually remember meeting with the backflip guys before DECA acquired Dragon Vale. So fun times. Cool. So I guess how would I phrase this? Okay. So I'm curious, a lot of people kind of have this mindset in the gaming industry that, especially in mobile, that a game has a certain lifespan. And once that lifespan is, done, the game is kind of dead. And hopefully before that point, we started with another game and like it's launched and doing well. Can you tell me a little bit about like, what's the DECA difference?
So I think what's also the DECA difference is that we are a company which focuses on this. We really try to find games which are really driven by a community who really cares for those games. So that's one of the things which we really look for when we're trying to get a new game. So once we do decide on that, we try to like really fine tune what it means to run that game, go through all the documentation, go through all the data, figure out what worked in the past, reach out to the community. We figure all of that. And in addition to that, we are a remote first company. So we have to do all of that and make sure that everything is transmitted to the rest of the team across the world. So the other thing is that we primarily look at how to create things sustainably. So sustainable LiveOps events, if all of the design and all of the content, we try to figure out how do you make it for the long term, because DECA is about running games for decades. So that's really important. And finally, I think we also focus a lot on one of the culture points, which is really important inside the studio, is working smarter, not harder. And that goes back to the previous point of sustainable LiveOps. You really have to figure out what is the team capable of, what do the players expect, and kind of manage a balance with that and figure out what's best for the games long term. So that's what the difference is. But the three main pillars, I would say, are delivering on time, figuring out whether the quality is up to par, like error and bug free, and also more importantly, creating meaningful content, which the community really cares about.
So you said sustainable live ops
Mhm.
events. What does that actually mean? Like, can you give me an example of maybe an unsustainable live ops event and maybe like a sustainable one?
Yeah. Um, a lot of times, some of the games, some of the games which don't survive soft launch itself, um, the the team behind it usually makes something which requires a lot of effort to create. That means either it could be content, or it could be systems, or it could be just incredibly detailed art assets. It's really in a quest to differentiate themselves from the market. I think sometimes people don't factor in what is the ultimate cost of creating things inside a game. Um, so from a live ops perspective, I would say, we what we try and do is we try to find what those highest impact items are inside the games that we run. So we look at where the rev is coming from, most of the revenue is coming from. Where we also look at what engages best with our community, um, and we also try to look at what are the diminishing points, the point of diminishing returns which are there. So we look at certain live ops features which we have put in, and then when we realize that the amount of effort does it justify the outcome, or be that with retention or with revenue, then we kind of axe it, because it's not worth it in the long term. You have limited amount of resources, limited amount of time, and you also need to be careful with your team's mental well-being. So you have to factor all of that in and try to figure out what's best for everybody. Um, so once we look at what is sustainable in that sort of way, we also try to figure out, did we get it right, or if we didn't get it right, we kind of document it in a lot. We have retrospectives. We try to figure out how to best optimize our process for the next iteration, and it just keeps going on. That iteration cycle is the one which I think we do quite well, where we look at what worked in the past, we try to figure out how to improve it, and then we invest on those things.
So would you say that picking your art style, like when you're getting ready to soft launch a game or whatnot, is crucial to being able to be sustainable, in the sense that if my art is too detailed and too complex, I'll never be able to hit this desired cadence that I have or whatnot, just because it's too costly and too time consuming to produce that? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. If you look at DECA's portfolio of games, we also focus a lot on 2D games. It's partially an effect of these games are older, but the other aspect of it is also that it's easier to produce those assets. While if you look at another game, let's say a really high definition 3D game, it's much more expensive to produce it, and you have to balloon up your team a lot, or rely on outsourcing partners to create the art, and then your margins just reduce so much more also. Like you need a certain amount of players and payers before it's sustainable for the long term. So I feel sometimes the market decides for the team what is what is a good art style, because
Yeah.
they tell you that, hey, I don't find this interesting, or I this is great, but I've tried so much, I have to get so many shards before I can get one of these things which I really care about.
Yeah.
So the the audience will eventually tell you, and the data will most probably back it up.
Interesting. Okay, I want to switch gears just a little bit, because you talked about the importance of, like, when you look to acquire a game, you look for an active, engaged community. So can you tell me, like, what are maybe some ways that you've used the community to come up with maybe like new feature ideas or whatnot? Because I know like some game teams are like, yeah, I'd love to talk to my players, but I don't have time to do that. They don't really have a way to do that. So how have you found that you can actually leverage the community in a way that, you know, makes for a better game?
That's an excellent question. And I've seen this problem which a lot of teams face. So first, I think it's important that you have like a really rock star community manager. It's super critical to have somebody who specializes in that, like an expert in that field. So DECA as a company really invests in that. We empower. So there are three sort of pillars which are there. There's like design, community, and data. Like these are the ways by which I and also the larger team, these are the lenses which we use to figure out what to do next. So all three people, be it the designer or the community manager or the PM, business analyst, all of these three components have an equal stake in the future of the game. So the product team and the design team usually try to figure out what to do, but from very, very early on in the process, we try to rope in the community through the community manager. I think that's super important. You need to go through the community manager because they will know how to frame the narrative well. Because a lot of the times it's more important to figure out how to say something, even if it's bad news. If it's delivered well, it's better for the game, the community, and also the team. So yeah, like I think that's how we go about doing it. And from a LiveOps perspective, I already mentioned that we keep the community in the loop. But what we also do is we have a smaller cohort of players who we kind of identify. We try and get them into a social space like either Discord server or any sort of platform where they can, it's a much smaller group and they can directly speak to us. A lot of other teams have also done the same. The community manager acts as a channel of information between the rest of the community and the team. We also have a sheet where we keep track of all the ideas which are coming in from the team, and then we prioritize them and we figure out what to add into the game. And finally, for an even smaller subset, we get them to sign an NDA and we share stuff which the rest of the community will only get to see later on. And those guys are evangelists. They look at features, or they look at balancing, they look at everything inside the game before anybody else in the community does. We trust them. We tell them explicitly that we want their feedback. We know that it is important for us to have these people who have played these games for 6, 7, 8 years. Like, most companies don't have employees who have worked on those games for 8 years, but these people know these games inside out. So we loop them in also very early, and then they give us incredible feedback, which we can quickly iterate on. So yeah.
That's really cool. So for these long run games, like, how do you wait? Like, let's say DECA buys a new game today, and you come in and you talk to your community. I imagine the things that the community wants is going to be more of those like quality of life things or bug fixes or some of those. So how do you weight those kind of things to keep a happy community versus like new features? Like, does it tend to be for these long run games that you guys focus a little bit more on the quality of life type features because that's what gets your community happy, or what's the balance usually?
The first thing, we are a LiveOps company. So the first thing which you figure out is what is the LiveOps cadence for the game? What do players expect from the game regularly? And that's the first thing which we address even before looking at quality of life or new features. From a LiveOps point, if we execute, like if we just got a new game and we execute on the event really well, or two events, and then we get a data pipeline sorted out, we got all of the prerequisites required to figure out that, hey, now the LiveOps is running really well. Once we do that, then we try and see, once that is stable, because that's directly related to the two most important metrics, which is retention and monetization. If those two are stable, then we move on to not only listening to what the players have been saying, because players have a lot of opinions. So we try to filter those out again to the community manager, and we put numbers to it. We try to prioritize and try to figure out what's best for the game at this point in its life, in its product lifespan. So yeah, like that. For example, with Dragon Whale, when we took over, that's what we effectively did for the first few months. We calmed the community down. We told them that, we are here to, we care about the game as much as they do. And we proved that they're capable of doing it by releasing one quality event after another. And once we got that done, then we shifted on to what is the feature which would really either really move the retention metrics, the monetization metrics, or ideally both. And then wait accordingly, and then we start working on those new features. And if a quality of life improvement also directionally helps those things, we will try to fund those also.
Interesting. Very interesting. I want to switch gears just a little bit, and we're going to lean in towards talking about data a little bit. But before we get there, I'm curious what your take is on segmentation. So as an example of what I consider bad segmentation or no segmentation at all, I don't know which one. I always found that when I was playing Clash Royale, I would usually have a prescribed deck that I'm leveling up. From my perspective, it should be fairly easy from the data to see that obviously I'm working on leveling up the Expo or the Knight or whatever, because that's the card that I'm requesting over and over again for my clan, and that's the one that I'm putting gold into when I hit it. Like, and once you get up to higher levels, like you do that for like months straight. And I always found it weird that whenever I'd go to the store, I'd have these special offers for like some card that like I'd never used, never requested, didn't have in any of my decks. And it just seemed like outlandish. Whereas like, hey, if they gave me a little offer or as part of like a special event, maybe the reward was like the last 10 cards that I needed to be able to like finish that up. Like I would be so focused on buying that thing or engaging in that thing or whatnot. So I think segmentation can make a better player experience if it's done right. But I don't think that many folks actually can get it right. So I'm curious, like what's your take on segmentation?
I think the last point which you made is mostly accurate. I think most people don't have the tools required to get the segmentation done right. Obviously, for me, the ideal scenario is where I just put a couple of parameters into a tool and then create offers just for those segments, and then it just works. Like that's the ideal case scenario. But often it's harder And because it's harder and it requires time and effort and really thinking of it from a high level strategic point of view, and then zooming in completely and looking at, oh, this sort of player plays these many times and there's like, this represents 2% of the audience. Doing that requires a lot of time, and since it requires a lot of time and effort, a lot of people, I think, don't put in that effort. They try to either make something for the entire audience, or they try to make it for a very specific segment, which is easier to figure out, like new players, like a new player offer, or they tie it to like a limited time event, for example. So even from my side, we do fewer segmentation based things than I would like, but I think it's because I haven't found the best tool till now.
Yeah. What sort of, for people that are maybe a little bit newer to segmentation, like what sort of ways have you found that breaking players up into different segments has worked well for you?
For us specifically, it's a bit more different because we deal with really engaged players. So, like D180 is long gone. Like we're talking about 5-6 years, like we're talking about players who really care. They know exactly, some of them even have like a sort of entertainment budget. They know that this is almost like a lifestyle for them. So with these players, we know who out of them what the pairs are also like, what they prefer, and since they, from a retention point, they've been in the game for a really long time, we try and focus on various engagement and the amount of revenue per user, for example, per month. Those are the two metrics we primarily focus on, and then we try to figure out, these sort of players, they from the data and from talking to them and from our own design intuition, we figure out that this is the sort of content which they find valuable. So we created for payer segments rather than for the life cycle of the player, because we do focus on new players also, but a lot of our effort is put into the existing players and trying to figure out where they belong and giving them something which is valuable to them, and that value takes a lot of time for the team to judge.
Yeah. So okay, so let me see if I can wrap my head around this and kind of understand. So you said something about paying players, but not just paying players and not just total revenue that they paid. You look at actually the revenue that they spend per month on average. So if you look at my player, maybe you'd make a segment and you say, hey, Tom spends $5 a month on average. And so maybe you'd start that with the segment, but then you'd further dig into the data to see, okay, well, what types of things does he spend that $5 on? This is what he makes it, or this is what he tends to spend on. So we're going to make a segment of players like Tom that spend $5 a month on this thing. Then you probably examine all the other players that also spend $5 a month, make a segment or an offer for each of those. Then you look at the players that spend $10 or $20 a month and kind of do something similar. Is that kind of a rough breakdown?
We try and surface things which is relevant to each of these audiences.
That's really interesting. I haven't really heard of that, but I mean, it makes sense, right? Like you probably have a certain budget per month that you can spend. And if you can give me something valuable per month of gameplay, like I know this is the game that I want to be playing and I've got $10 a month to spend on it, and you give me something awesome to spend that $10 on, well, I'll probably do that every month for you.
Yeah, I think it's also important to know that these are games which people are choosing to spend their time on. So we try and figure out how much time they're spending. We figure out how much money they're also choosing to spend, and we try and see what can we do from our side to let to retain them for as long as possible. And that means just looking at different sort of players and trying to figure out, be it from a limited time event currency, how to price it, or try to figure out how do you depreciate the value of certain items inside your game. If something's released 5 years ago, it shouldn't be costing the same thing it cost 5 years ago. It's important that you have some parallels with the real world. And yeah, like this, I think it's really important to respect your audience. And when you do that, and the players will figure it out. And that's one of the things which we have seen time and again, where when we when we are clear with players of why we are doing things, they usually really appreciate it, and then they almost always give constructive feedback and criticism if we do go the other way.
Interesting. Okay. I want to now delve a little bit deeper into the data on those types of things, because I imagine that as good as you guys think you are at figuring out what sort of offer, players like Tom that spend $5 a month buying these kind of things, you probably want to do some sort of like A/B testing or data to, understand that kind of thing. So tell me a little bit more about like the data side. What sort of tests do you guys do? What sort of things do you delve into? How do you utilize the data that you have to make better game experiences?
Yeah, right now we are actually just properly kicking off some of the A/B testing related experiment wrapping, which we are doing. But from data point of view, we usually try and have a hypothesis, some sort of thing which we want to try and figure out an answer to. And since we have so many data points coming in every single second, we try to back it with real player data. So just keep looking at your dashboards and trying to keep slicing it till you figure out whether it's backing your initial hypothesis. So the figuring out what the question which you're trying to answer is goes back to the working smarter, not harder thing which I spoke about, which is where we really try to hone in on what to solve for rather than just going through the data and hoping that we get an insight from that. And with A/B testing, that translates into creating meaningful variance. And meaningful variance need to make sense from a design point of view and from a community point of view, primarily because our communities are small, so they will talk to each other. And if it doesn't feel right from a design point of view, the community will definitely tell you very quickly that, why are you doing A, B, and C? They will come back to you and say, hey, maybe, this my friend, and here's a screenshot, got this. So like, what's the problem? Which is why we try to only make meaningful experiments. And also we try to also speak to the community early and ask them, we are thinking of doing something like this. What do you think of it? And if they say, this is what we like, we go back to the real data which is there, see whether there's any sort of comparison which we can make with existing data, and then take a decision rather than experimenting with the community and hoping for the best.
Here's an interesting idea. I only think about this because I'm using the UserWise framework, but have you ever done something where you like let the player choose their own experience, where it's like, hey, which special offer would you like to get next week? And you have, maybe like 4 screenshot options of, different bundles for the same price or whatnot. And then depending on what they choose, that's actually the offer that they then, drive themselves, probably making it more likely that they would actually buy it in theory.
I'm not sure about that, because usually the way I like to approach anything related to monetization design is giving players as few choices as possible so that there isn't decision paralysis. So when, like, I've seen stuff like this in AFK Arena, for example, where you can build your own bundle, right? Often the issue which I have with those sort of bundles is that I don't know what is good. What might be good right now might not be valuable for me 4 days from now. So I always try to make sure that I go for something where it's really clearly stated, this is the value, it's 60% off or whatever it is, rather than giving players the option to decide how it is, because it's not interesting gameplay, I feel. If I'm able to build my own bundle, I'm spending that time doing that instead of, I don't know, defeating something or breeding a cool dragon or something like that. So it goes back to the amount of time which players have. For me, it's specific things which players need to choose from. Most probably it's not too many of them, and keeping on iterating on what those things are.
Yeah. Okay. So I have seen this maybe like in one game, or at least I saw a screenshot of it. But I'm going to talk about a couple experiences that I've had not in a game. And I'm curious your take on if they could translate into the game. So I don't know, this might have been like a year ago or something, but there's a pizza place in town that we sometimes get from. I think it's like Papa Murphy's. It's like this take and bake. It's kind of like a chain, but pizza bake's pretty good, and like our kids eat it well. So they have a deal on Tuesdays. It's $10 Tuesdays. So like any pizza, $10. So we decided to get pizza. And as I was going to the checkout page, well, mind you, at this point in time, I'm starving hungry, really want pizza. I go to the checkout page and they're like, do you want any of these additional things? Well, the pizza's $10, but I can also add like cheesy breadsticks for only $5 more. And I can add like some cookies for like only another $5. So I think I might've added those things. And I ended up like doubling the cost of what I was spending. But it was like an upsell. On the flip side, Amazon. So our house was built, it's like really airtight. So we always have to have a dehumidifier, like pulling the stuff out. Otherwise it kind of can get moldy inside, or at least thus our builder told us. So bought one, eventually it died. Don't know why. It just kind of stopped working. So I had to go buy another one on Amazon. So as I'm shopping on Amazon, I go to buy a dehumidifier. And, I got in my cart, I go to the checkout page, and they said, customers that bought this also frequently bought this other thing. What was this other thing they recommended? Well, it was like this like dinky little 10-foot garden hose, which like nobody ever needs a 10-foot garden hose, right? Like that's the stupidest thing to buy. Cause like if you're trying to water your yard or something, like you need at least like a 50-foot hose, right? Not true if you're buying a dehumidifier, because dehumidifier every like week I'd have to like go downstairs, empty it out, bring it upstairs, pour out the water, put it back down. But if I get this hose, I can hook it up to the back and set it so it goes into the drain in my basement, and it just like automatic, and I don't even have to think about it again. It's like the perfect thing that I need to accompany this other thing that I'm buying. And it's, hey, do you want to do that upsell and spend a little bit more and get this additional value? I'm curious, like, could that type of a thing translate into a game to kind of do that upsell to players? Or is it just adding too much friction? I'm overthinking it and I'm just dreaming. But like in both cases, I spent more money than I would have otherwise, and I had a better experience. Those cookies were good.
All right. I think both those scenarios are really interesting. With the first one, just trying to um, make you take a sort of impulsive decision when you were till that point taking a relatively rational decision. And with the second one, I think that's also super interesting because basically there's like a lot of data which Amazon anyway has. So that's where I think the difference comes in. Amazon knows, and it has enough people who can figure it out where, what are these sort of connections between these separate data points where one is a dehumidifier and one is a hose. I think one of the things which people don't initially find surprising is why is this being recommended, but only once you figured out that connection is when you're like, oh my God, this is genius, right? With a game economy, depends on your content depth also. The system is kind of like you're effectively creating a closed economic system, right? Where there are certain items inside the game. Each of those items have some sort of value, but those values, if like ideally should translate to some sort of dollar value in your backend. So if a hard currency is, you get 100 hard currency for $1, each hard currency is 1 cent, for example. So if there's a upsell system which is created inside the game, first you need to be sure that you have the right people to be able to implement it and keep iterating and on it till the player understands that you're doing it for their own good. It needs to have some sort of benefit to them. And I think that is where the hardest things are, because creating that system and recommendation algorithms in general are incredibly hard. So if you have a limited menu, for example, what the pizza place had, then you can upsell a dessert because at that point, I want to just complete my meal in some sort of way. But if your game has, it's unlikely, but if your game has 100,000 pieces of content, then figuring out which content is interesting with which other content is going to require a lot of effort from just trying to figure out what the connections between these two things are, and it'll require a lot of iteration with the community. And I think that is where a lot of game studios don't get too deep into it, because it takes so much effort just to make a fun game that if you have a dedicated set of people just working on the upsell or the recommendation offer, then you're taking resources away from making the game. And that's why initially I was saying that I don't see the advantage, but that's because I've always worked in teams where we're trying to focus on how to make the best LiveOps experience as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And when you focus on that, you're effectively taking away resources away from making the LiveOps feature or making a new feature or making a quality of life improvement. So unless there's a plug and go system, it's hard.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. So thinking about LiveOps a bit, can you tell me what sort of like tools and systems you really need to be able to deliver? Like you talked about this work smarter, not harder type of experience. So like what sort of tools and systems do you need to be able to deliver this kind of consistent, ever improving gameplay experience?
Mm-hmm. I guess the first thing is just like really robust documentation of what the content is inside the game. Ideally, you should be able to also figure out very quickly what the value of each of these pieces of content are. I think that's the bedrock. Then on top of that, access to tools like Firebase or to Tableau, and just trying to figure out what's going on inside the game at any given point of time quickly. That's the next thing. And the third thing, which is more soft, is deciding at what point to reach out to your core set of community players and asking them for help. I think those are the three things.
Very cool. I know you said like having a community manager is like, super important and stuff. How did you guys how do you pick those players that you sign NDAs with that are, going to be able to, I imagine like some players, especially if I'm showing them like balancing and stuff, like I can't imagine like, like my little brother works on Warzone, doing data science. And a lot of what he does is balancing the different guns and stuff like that, which I think can be incredibly hard because certain guns, if you put them in the hands of a certain player, they're just like insanely accurate because they just like blow people away. But everyone else that gets that like thinks that gun is like super underpowered because they never kill someone because they like lack that aiming skill depth or whatnot. So going through that level of balancing and stuff, I think could be really intense for certain players. Like, how do you pick which players would be able to do that type of thing?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And how we go about doing it is that since we have players who have played our games for 6, 8, 10 years at points, they kind of know the game inside out. And they also bubble up in existing social networks. So you most probably know a player from your game who is very vocal about what they like or what they don't like. Once you vet, let's say a dozen or so of them, then the community manager, who's also vetting the players, he or she reaches out to them and tries to figure out how interested they'll be in actually being involved in this process. Because some people just don't care. They like hanging out with other people, they like sharing their thoughts, but they don't like the process of building. And that's fine. We appreciate them playing our game. That itself is like the best thing. So once the community manager figures out who are the people who have the most insightful things to say about the game, then we kind of start talking to them one-on-one. We try to figure out, they are trying to figure out what we want from them. We are trying to figure out what they can also provide. So it's like building a relationship with them, and we give them the trust, and in turn they also trust in us, and they believe that we are here to run the game for the long term. So yeah, I think that's how we go about doing it. First, trying to figure out who are these players, then trying to reach out to them and trying to figure out whether they'll be interested in something like this. And then, just like all relationships, just taking it one step at a time. And if there's a point where somebody wants to leave, that's fine. We usually try to look at the community and try to figure out how to replace them in that group with somebody else, so that there's always a balance of voices rather than 10 people in a room and one person is the only one who's saying the most.
Yeah. Okay. In the last 5 minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of design pillar that you talked about. So one of the things that I think you said is play your game every day, which I think everyone should do. It's very easy not to sometimes. And I've seen some bad things happen if you don't do that. But the other one is figure out what your competition is doing. I've seen some people that focus too much on competitor games and whatnot. So I'm curious, what's the right balance of how often should you be playing competitor games? How should you be analyzing the new features and things that come out? Because I think it's very easily to like feel like, oh, they released this thing, I need to like get a feature out just like that, like immediately, or the sky's gonna fall.
Yeah, I don't know. That's something which we need to deal with also, because we need to figure out what's working well with our game, and we need to figure out what things to put inside the game so that our players play the game for how much ever long they find it enjoyable. So with almost all things, I think it comes down to trying to figure out why something works. So let's just take an example of like a battle pass system. I think almost every game nowadays has a battle pass system, but we had a discussion about this with Dragon Wheel, for example, and the Dragon Wheel uh, engagement and monetization system relies on limited time events which have limited time currencies, and a battle pass is a set of milestones which you get progression on by earning currency, so some sort of progression currency. So we looked at what a battle pass does, and the the two-tier approach, and just looking at it from all angles, trying to distill out why it works, rather than just copying it, seeing what existing systems are there in the game, and are they not working? Has the community said X is not working well or Y is not working well? Figure out whether you're like actually fixing a problem which needs to be fixed for. So when you play computer games, I usually try and figure out what is the inherent underlying problem which is being solved. And if I really understand that well, and that takes like weeks or months of playing that game, I don't think most people will be able to understand Dragon Wheel as a game without playing it for 2 months, at least. So once you get that, that is when you balance it out with your own design intuition. You look at existing player data and you look at the sentiment of your community, and then try to figure out, is this the best thing which is there for our player base right now? And that's where I try to factor in. It's just one of them. It's one of the things which I look at, which is what is the competition doing, and maybe it works for them because their audience is different from us, or they're at a different point of the game's life cycle. So what might work well for others won't work well for us because it's not fitting in. It's not a jigsaw puzzle piece which fits. I can ram it into place, but if eventually it will have diminishing returns, and then you would have sunk 6 to 8 months of effort, and before you know it, it's going into the red.
Yeah, that's really great feedback. So to kind of summarize, it's important to play competitor games when they add new features, and it's important to understand from a design standpoint, what were they trying to solve with that feature? Because you don't actually know if it actually did the thing that it's supposed to, right? Because more often than not, we release new features and it doesn't move the metrics we were hoping. So you got to try to understand what were they trying to do, but then you have to come back to your game and say, what are our top 2 or 3 problems that our game has right now that we most need to fix? And what things can we do to actually address those problems? Maybe it's this competitor feature thing, or maybe it's something else. Is that like a good summary?
Yeah. And it's likely that there are existing systems inside the game which needs to be improved. So, like maybe the competitors have already sorted out some system which your game is just having a MVP version of. So it really comes down to balancing the amount of resources which you have with the capabilities of what you want to put inside, with the ambition of what you want to put inside the game. So it's keep needing to balance it out, and like doing the basics right constantly is itself hard. So if once you're making sure that your games is working fine consistently, that itself is like a tremendous achievement, and I think a lot of game teams just struggle with that.
That's great. Well, dude, I feel like we could keep going for like another hour, but we're actually about out of time here. So I have one last question for you, because we are in the Mastering Retention podcast, of course. And that's, what's one tip or trick you've found over the years to help increase player retention? Like, how do you keep them playing for longer?
Usually, I try to break it down into 3 categories. If it's a new player, I try to figure out what is the tutorial funnel, try to get players to the interesting stuff as quickly as possible. With midterm D30 retention, one of the things which we try to focus on is, are players getting the stuff that we want them to get for that player journey? If we keep looking at data to figure out, are they on that track? And if they're not on that track, how do we realign things so that they go to that idealized track? And for long term, which is what we need to deal with a lot, is, are we creating interesting content and systems which will surprise and delight our most loyal players? You kind of need to balance out, again, what is the team's experience with the game, what is the community's sentiment, and the player data, all of them together. If you factor all of those in, you'll be able to figure out whether the long-term retention is going in the right direction. And this is almost always the hardest thing to do, because you might add a system which you think is interesting now, but it might have a sort of domino effect into the future. So that's why you need to balance all of these 3 things out.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Abhay. If folks do have any questions about you or DECA or anything like that, is there a good way to get in contact with you?
Yep, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can just send me a message. Yeah, always
Sounds
willing
great.
to reply.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.